today's show, host Jack Patty, Ray the DA, and Assistant Commonwealth Attorneys Luanna Redcorn and Kathy Phillips will discuss the prosecution case of Steve Nunn. Back in 2009, Steve was charged with the killing of his fiancée, Amanda Ross. Stay tuned for more details.
Two shows to it. We weren't sure last week that was dedicated to just the investigative part of this case if we'd even get through that. We barely did. We squeaked by at the end of the program thanks to Detective Iddings and some fast talking at the end of the show. But now that today we're going to talk about the prosecutorial part of this case. That is, of course, the murder of Amanda Ross that occurred in 2009. Former state lawmaker Steve Nunn has pled guilty to the intentional murder with an aggravated circumstance. And maybe if you could, Ray, start us off with a little recap of last week for those who might not have been listening, and then introduce us to our guests in the studio.
Okay, well, last week we talked about the investigative part of this case, and Detective Todd Iddings was the case officer, which means he's the lead detective on it. He not only does the significant part of the investigation, but also is the person that receives all of the information from anybody else that's working on it, because this was a number of people participated in this investigation. And what he discovered was that the initial suspect in this case was in fact Steve Nunn, and he went through the process of collecting evidence there at the scene, and then he went down to the Hart County to the cemetery where Steve Nunn was, and then there was additional investigation done in Glasgow at the home of Steve Nunn, and there was all sorts of circumstantial evidence that pointed towards Steve Nunn, including this black Honda vehicle that was subsequently, we think, determined to be the car that was in Fayette County about the time that Amanda Ross was murdered. He was charged with the crime, but we were in such a hurry to get the investigative part finished last week that we really didn't talk about a lot of the investigation, and we'll try to touch on that.
Okay.
But one of the most interesting things, Jack, because there's been a release of part of the police investigative file, through an open records request by various media sources. And I normally don't read comments. I normally don't read many stories in the paper about it. But I did this because I wanted to see just what was released. And then I stumbled onto this group of anonymous comments that are made after these stories. And there was one that, it frankly, is pretty typical of the public, I think.
Not understanding how it works, or what? How do you mean that?
Well, based on this one, this crime was heinous. The case was straightforward and easy to prosecute, is what it said. The defendant was convicted and never challenged his own guilt. Easy to prosecute is the thing that caused me to go straight up and scatter, because it's obvious if you really know about prosecuting circumstantial cases, they're never easy. Yeah. And so one of the things I wanted to talk about with you, and you asked us to, is the prosecution of this thing. And because while Todd and the other detectives and patrol officers are out investigating, we in our office, the prosecutor's office, are trying to figure out how are we going to approach this thing, and what's the evidence show so far, and how can we prove this case, and that sort of thing. And that's why we've asked, Detective Todd Iddings is back with us, Mary Houlihan, who is in charge of our victim services and has worked very closely with the family of Amanda Ross during this process, and Luanna Redcorn, who is the first assistant in the office. And we kind of asked Luanna to coordinate the prosecution of this case. And so she involved Kathy Phillips, and she'll tell you why, and then she dragged me into it and gave me some assignments, and this is what you're going to be doing in this case, Ray. So Luana, welcome. Todd, welcome. Mary, welcome.
Thank you, Ray.
So this thing happened on September 11, 2009. We were aware of it. We became aware of it very quickly. So tell us the process that we kind of follow in our office as we try to put this case together in anticipation of a trial.
Well, as Todd was saying last week, when we begin a case like this, a very serious one and a one that's obviously going to be a lot of days. So after he's charged, there's still plenty of work to be done. And one of the areas that the investigators were focusing on were what were the events days before Amanda was murdered in the parking lot? What was Steve Nunn doing? What was Amanda Ross doing? Because these are things that are helpful in determining what he was thinking and what she might have been thinking in the moments leading up to the murder.
So how did we we have to develop sort of a strategy. We don't have to prove motive in Kentucky, and I don't think in many states you have to prove motive. But it's good to know because the jury wants to know.
And in this case, you had motive, didn't you?
Absolutely.
Well, we think so. But the point is we have to begin, as Luana said, we have to begin to formulate a strategy on how we have to begin to anticipate defenses. We have to think in terms of proof issues. We got to think in terms of who's going to be responsible for these various areas in a trial, because I guess the investigative file, Todd, that you put together was several thousand pages.
Yes, that's correct.
And what we have to do, Jack, is anticipate getting a jury who doesn't know much about the case. And so the question is, how do we develop a story or the facts of this case so that they can easily understand it? And that becomes very difficult. So what do we do?
Well, we met with the investigators, and Todd and Kathy Phillips, who Ray mentioned, is an attorney in our office that has been very devoted to developing an expertise in the area of domestic violence. So in looking at what happened the week before, Kathy also set about trying to look at the history of the relationship between Steve Nunn and Amanda Ross. And of course, one of those areas is going back and trying to see if there was ever police intervention. That's helpful because that gives us an official record of when events might have occurred. And Todd, were you all able to determine whether or not there had been a history of domestic violence between Steve Nunn and Amanda Ross?
We did. We've had 3 calls for service. 2 of those generated domestic violence reports.
Right.
To learn more, tune in every Friday morning at 9 a.m. on News Talk 590.